Each testimony builds a stronger case. Every sharp focus reveals clarity. Learning your legal rights, upholding unyielding justice.
Sweetheart, who is this man to you?
He's my daddy.
She is my daughter, sir.
I didn't ask you. Is he telling you to say that, sweetheart?
No.
The candles were lit on the pancakes when the officer walked into the restaurant. They were two small candles, the kind you buy in a box of 20 in the party aisle at the supermarket, and they were planted on top of two stacks of pancakes at a red upholstered booth table at an IHOP in Ohio on a morning in October 2020. The girl beside the man was wearing a paper gold crown, the kind restaurants give to customers celebrating birthdays. And there was, at that table, the specific quality of a breakfast that had been planned in advance because it meant something, because there was a child who had woken up that morning knowing it was her special day and that her father had promised pancakes with candles. That scene, a father and daughter celebrating a birthday at a restaurant on a weekday morning, would be interrupted by something neither of them had planned, and that the body camera of the officer who walked through the door would capture in enough detail for the entire world to see what had happened in that red upholstered booth. The body camera had been recording since before the officer entered the restaurant. It recorded everything, as body cameras do, without discriminating between what would matter and what would not, without knowing that that specific file would become one of the most watched videos of that month in that country. The timestamp in the upper right corner marked 10:51 in the morning. It was a Friday morning. The restaurant had the typical weekday IHOP traffic, a few tables occupied, staff circulating with coffee pots, the smell of pancake batter and maple syrup that is the specific smell of that kind of place. And there was, in that environment, in a booth near the window, a gray-bearded black man and a light-haired white girl with a gold crown on her head, celebrating something that had begun that morning as the kind of memory children carry for the rest of their lives. The man's name was Robert. He was 56 years old, had retired 2 years earlier after a career as a maintenance supervisor at a manufacturing company, and had adopted the girl beside him, whose name was Ayla, when she was 2 years old, after a process that had lasted 18 months and had involved home visits, psychological evaluations, court hearings, and all the steps the system places between a child and a permanent home. Ayla was turning 6 that October morning. Robert had promised her that the birthday breakfast would be special, had chosen IHOP, because Ayla had specifically requested pancakes and had arrived early enough to secure a good table before the weekend crowd. It was an ordinary Friday morning at an ordinary restaurant, and there was nothing in that scene that should have drawn anyone's attention beyond the two of them. Someone in the restaurant had called the emergency number. The call had described an adult black man with a small white child who appeared frightened and who was possibly being held against her will. That description, which the body camera and dispatch records would document with precision for subsequent analysis, had been made by someone who had looked at Robert and Ayla sitting in that booth, and had reached a conclusion about what they were seeing before verifying any fact, before asking anything, before considering any explanation beyond the one they had immediately constructed upon seeing a black man beside a white child. The conclusion had been kidnapping. And that conclusion had been enough for an officer to be dispatched to that IHOP that morning with a narrative already formed about what they would find when they arrived. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. What that body camera captured in that restaurant in Ohio is one of the most disturbing and most important recordings this channel has ever analyzed. Not for violence, because there is no physical violence in this story, but for what it reveals about the kind of assumption that can transform a birthday breakfast into a crime investigation. Hit subscribe right now and tell me in the comments. Can you imagine celebrating your child's birthday when an officer walks in and asks whether the child is being forced to stay with you? Tell me down below. The body camera captured the moment the officer arrived at Robert and Ayla's table with the candles still lit on the pancakes. It captured Robert's expression when he realized what was happening, an expression any parent would recognize as the expression of someone simultaneously understanding the personal danger of the situation and the need not to let that danger manifest in a way that frightens the child beside them. It captured Ayla's expression, who at 6 years old did not fully understand what was happening, but understood enough to know that something had changed in that morning that had begun with a promise of pancakes. And it captured, with enough clarity to be transcribed and analyzed by anyone watching the video, the officer bending down toward Ayla and asking, in that specific tone used with children, when adults want information they believe the child is being prevented from giving, whether the man beside her had told her to say what she was saying. Robert had arrived at the IHOP at 10:23 that morning, according to the restaurant's point-of-sale system record that documented the time the order had been placed. He had arrived holding hands with Ayla, had asked for the booth she had pointed to near the window because from there you could see the street and Ayla liked watching cars go by while she ate, and had asked the waiter for the birthday crown that the restaurant offered to customers who were celebrating. The waiter had brought the crown, had sung happy birthday along with a colleague who had been called over to join in, and had taken a photo of the two of them on Robert's phone at his request, a photo that existed on that phone at that moment, and that documented with a simplicity no legal document could replicate what that table represented that morning. 2 smiles, a gold crown, pancakes on the way. The person who had made the emergency call was sitting 3 tables away from Robert and Ayla. They had observed the two for several minutes before picking up the phone, according to what would be reconstructed subsequently through the statements of other witnesses who were in the restaurant that morning and who had paid attention to what had happened before the police arrived. None of those witnesses had observed anything they would describe as suspicious behavior on Robert's part, or any sign that Ayla was afraid or uncomfortable. What the witnesses described was a birthday breakfast, the crown, the pancakes, the waiter singing happy birthday. One specific witness, a woman who was sitting in the booth immediately behind Robert and Ayla's, said she had heard the conversation between the two for several minutes before the officer arrived, and that what she had heard was exactly what it appeared to be: a father answering a 6-year-old's questions about what she wanted to do after breakfast. The officer who had been dispatched was Detective Sergeant Kevin Collins. He had 15 years of service, had worked on crimes against children cases for 6 of those years, and had arrived at the IHOP with the call description in his ear and with the kind of focus that professionals with that specific background develop, a focus that is valuable when a real crime exists, but that can become an obstacle when the premise orienting it is wrong. Collins had entered the restaurant with 1 additional agent, had located Robert and Ayla at the window booth in less than 10 seconds, and had walked toward them, with the posture the body camera captured as the posture of someone approaching a situation they have already classified before arriving. The candles were still lit on the pancakes when he reached the table. Collins had addressed Robert first, asking his name and requesting identification. Robert had provided both without hesitation, had removed his wallet from his pocket with deliberately slow and visible movements, had shown his driver's license. Collins had examined the document and then had done something the body camera captured, and that would become one of the most analyzed moments of the video. He had turned to Ayla. He had crouched slightly to be at her level, had adopted that specific tone of voice adults use with children when they want to appear non-threatening while obtaining information, and had begun asking questions. He had asked her name. He had asked who the man beside her was. He had asked if she was okay. And then he had asked the question the camera captured, and that appeared in the caption of the image that would become the most shared of the entire case. He had asked whether the man had told her to say what she was saying. Ayla was 6 years old and was wearing a gold birthday crown, and there were pancakes with candles in front of her. She had answered Collins' questions with the specific directness of young children who have not yet developed the layer of social filtering that adults use to soften information. She had said her own name. She had said the man beside her was her father. She had said she was okay. And when Collins had asked the question about whether her father had told her to say that, Ayla had looked at him with that expression the camera captured in detail, and that anyone who has ever interacted with 6-year-olds would immediately recognize. The expression of someone who has received a question that makes no sense to them, and who is processing why an adult would be asking something so obviously unnecessary. She had answered no, that her father had not told her to say anything, that he was her real father, and that it was her birthday. Robert had remained still during that exchange between Collins and Ayla. The body camera captured him in the background during the questions directed at his daughter, and what it captured was a containment that went beyond ordinary self-control. It was the specific containment of a black father who understands that any movement he makes at that moment, any word he says without being asked, any emotional reaction that spills over, can be interpreted in a way that worsens a situation that had already reached a level it should never have reached. He had kept his hands visible on the table, had maintained a neutral expression in the way it is possible to maintain a neutral expression when what you really want to do is pick up your 6-year-old daughter and leave that restaurant as quickly as possible. He had waited, and the camera had recorded every second of that wait with the precise indifference of a device that does not know what it is documenting but documents anyway. Collins had continued asking Ayla questions for a few more minutes after her initial response. The body camera captured that sequence with a clarity that made audible not just the words but the tone of each exchange. And what the tone communicated was something that child interview specialists who later analyzed the video would describe as an approach that had been designed, probably without deliberate awareness on Collins' part, to produce a specific response rather than discover the truth. The questions were not open-ended. They were questions that contained premises, that assumed there was something to be uncovered beyond what Ayla had already said, that treated her responses as potentially unreliable for reasons that an adult's logic could construct, but that the actual experience of that child did not support. Ayla had answered every question with the same direct consistency with which she had answered the first, because the truth she was describing was the truth she knew, and that did not change regardless of how many times or in how many different ways someone asked. Robert had asked to speak at a certain point in the interaction, and Collins had raised his hand in a gesture the camera captured as the gesture of someone signaling that it was not Robert's turn, that the conversation at that moment was with the child, and that he should wait. That gesture, of a police officer silencing a father while interrogating his 6-year-old daughter at a birthday table, had been captured by the camera with a clarity that several legal commentators would describe as the most revealing moment of the entire recording, because it concentrated in a single frame the entire imbalance of the situation. Robert had lowered his hand and had waited, and the camera had kept recording. The second agent who had arrived with Collins had been positioned in a way that Collins's camera captured in the background, and his position was the position of someone monitoring Robert while Collins conducted the interaction with Ayla. That division of attention, Collins focused on the child and the second agent monitoring Robert, was a configuration that made sense in a context where there was real reason to suspect immediate danger. But the pancakes were on the table. The crown was on Ayla's head. The waiter who had brought the crown and sung happy birthday was a few meters away and had been observed by both agents when they had entered the restaurant. There was a context in that booth that anyone arriving without formed premises would immediately recognize, and that context had been ignored in a way that the camera was documenting in real time. It was the restaurant manager who introduced the element that finally began moving the situation in a different direction. He had observed the interaction from the beginning, had initially been uncertain whether he should intervene, and had decided to approach when Collins had begun the third round of repeated questions to Ayla. The manager, a man in his mid-40s who had worked at that establishment for 12 years, had approached the table and had told Collins that he knew Robert, that he was a regular customer for years, that he came regularly with his daughter, and that there had never been any problem of any kind associated with their presence. He had said this with the specific calm of someone providing factual information they consider relevant, and who expects that information to be treated as such. Collins had listened, had thanked him for the information, and had continued with the interaction the way he had been conducting it before the manager's intervention. There were other customers in the restaurant who had been observing that scene from varying distances, and with expressions that the cameras on their own phones, which at least 3 of them had begun using discreetly since the situation had begun, captured as expressions of people who were watching something that disturbed them, but who were unsure whether they should intervene. That hesitation, which is understandable in a context where there is active police presence, had kept the other witnesses silent for a period that subsequent analysis of the timestamps of the individual recordings would estimate at approximately 8 minutes from Collins' arrival to the moment when one of the witnesses, a woman named Patricia, who had been sitting in the booth behind Robert and Ayla's since before any of the parties involved had arrived, had stood up and walked to the table. Patricia had stood up and had told Collins, with a firmness that the other customers' recordings captured with enough clarity to be transcribed, that she had arrived at the restaurant before Robert and Ayla, that she had observed everything from the beginning, that the child had arrived holding that man's hand, that both had been greeted by the waiter, who knew them by name, that she had watched the crown being placed on the girl's head and the candles being lit on the pancakes, and that what Collins was doing at that moment was not investigating a crime, but was ruining a 6-year-old child's birthday in front of that child. She had said that and then had stood there, waiting. Collins had looked at her, had looked at Robert, had looked at Ayla with the gold crown and the pancakes going cold on the table. And for the first time since he had entered that restaurant, something in his posture had changed in a way the body camera captured, but for which there was no simple word to describe beyond belated recognition. Collins asked Robert to accompany him to the area near the restaurant entrance to speak separately, away from the table where Ayla had stayed with the second agent beside her. Robert had agreed, had said a few words to Ayla before standing up, words that Collins' camera had captured with audio clear enough to be transcribed. He had told her to stay still, that he would be back in a minute, that the pancakes would be there when he came back. Ayla had looked at her father with that expression the camera had captured, and that Patricia, the witness who had stood up, would later describe as the expression of a child who does not understand what is happening, but who trusts that her father will sort it out. The specific expression of someone who has been taught over 4 years of living together that when her father says he will be back in a minute, he comes back. Near the entrance area, away from Ayla, Collins had asked the question Robert had been expecting since the officer had arrived. At the table, he had asked Robert to prove he was the girl's father. Robert had returned to his wallet, had removed a laminated card he had been carrying since the adoption process had been finalized. The adoption decree in a reduced format that attorneys who work with adoption sometimes recommend that adoptive parents of children with different phenotypic appearance from themselves carry in situations of public movement. That card existed because Robert had been advised by the attorney who had processed the adoption that situations like that one were not unlikely, that the specific combination of a black father and a white daughter in public spaces generated a kind of attention that documentation helped manage. He had heard that advice, had thought it was the kind of unnecessary precaution he hoped never to need, and had carried the card anyway because the attorney had been persuasive, and because deep down he had understood that the attorney was right. Collins had examined the document, had verified the names, had verified the date, had verified the judicial process number that was recorded on the card and that was verifiable in the court system. The examination had taken perhaps 2 minutes, during which Robert had stood with his hands visible and his gaze going periodically toward Ayla, who was visible from where they were at the table he had left, with the second agent beside her. When Collins had finished examining the document, he had paused before returning it in a way the camera captured as the pause of someone processing the distance between the narrative they had brought to the restaurant and the reality they had found. He had returned the card without immediate comment on its contents, and then he had said he needed to verify the document in the system before he could release Robert. That verification had taken 11 minutes. 11 minutes during which Robert had stood in an area near the entrance of an IHOP on a Friday morning while his 6-year-old daughter waited at a birthday booth table with a police officer beside her and cooling pancakes and candles that had already gone out. Other customers who came and went from the restaurant during those 11 minutes passed by Robert and the scene with those expressions that the phone recordings of those still inside the restaurant kept capturing in the background. The manager had returned behind the counter, but had kept his gaze in the direction of the situation. Patricia had returned to her booth, but had kept her phone in her hand, and Collins' body camera had kept recording everything, including every minute of those 11 in which Robert had stood, waiting for a system to confirm what a judicial document had already established. The verification had returned positive. The adoption decree was legitimate. The judicial process existed in the court records. Robert was legally Ayla's father, with all the rights and responsibilities that designation created under Ohio law. Collins had communicated that confirmation to Robert in language the camera captured as the language of someone who is technically acknowledging a fact without fully recognizing the implications of what that fact meant in relation to everything that had happened in the previous 23 minutes. He had said that everything was in order, that Robert was free to return to the table, and had added, almost as a postscript, that he was sorry for the inconvenience. That word, inconvenience, used to describe 23 minutes of interrogation of a father and his 6-year-old daughter at a birthday table based exclusively on the assumption that a black man could not be the father of a white child, was captured by the camera with the same fidelity with which it had captured every other word that morning. Robert had returned to the table where Ayla was waiting. Collins's camera had captured that return. Robert sitting back down in the booth, Ayla looking at her father with that expression that had been on her face the entire time he had been away. Robert had looked at the pancakes that were cold now, had looked at the candles that had gone out, had looked at the gold crown on his daughter's head that was still there because Ayla had not taken it off, and he had said something to her that the camera captured, but that the audio had not fully preserved, only the last words, which were the words any father would say in a situation like that. One, and which were also in the reading of anyone who watched the video, knowing what had happened in those 23 minutes, the most devastating words of the entire morning. He had said that everything was okay, that Daddy was here, that they could still have the birthday breakfast. The video reached the public in a way Robert had not planned and had initially not wanted. He had left the IHOP that morning with Ayla, had returned home, had tried to salvage what remained of that birthday with a second celebration attempt in the backyard with cake and the presents he had saved for that afternoon. He had put Ayla to bed that night, with the crown still on the bedside table because she had asked to keep it, and had sat in the kitchen after she fell asleep, processing that morning with the specific quality of silence that exists when an experience has been too large to fully process at the moment it happened. He had called the attorney who had handled the adoption process at 10 that night. The attorney had answered, had listened to the account, and had said 3 things in sequence that Robert would later describe as the 3 sentences that had changed the direction of what would happen next. He had said that what Robert had described was illegal. He had said there was a body camera that had recorded everything, and he had said that Robert needed to decide what he wanted to do with that. Robert had asked for time to think. It had taken 5 days. During those 5 days he had spoken with his sister, had spoken with a close friend who was a university professor, and who had experience thinking about questions of race and justice in a way Robert trusted, and had had a conversation with Ayla that had been the most difficult of the 3 because it involved trying to explain to a 6-year-old, in language a 6-year-old could process, why that morning had happened the way it had happened. Ayla had asked the question 6-year-olds ask when they do not understand something. She had asked why the police officer had thought her father was not her real father. Robert had been silent for a moment before responding. He had said that sometimes people see 2 people together and make assumptions about them before asking anything, and that those assumptions are sometimes wrong. Ayla had processed that for a few seconds, and then had asked whether the officer had apologized. Robert had said yes, that he had said he was sorry for the inconvenience. Ayla had looked at her father with that direct 6-year-old expression, and had said that was not a real apology. Robert had agreed that it was not. The decision to make the video public had been made on the 5th day, after the attorney had explained that the request for the recording needed to be made within a specific time frame, and that waiting longer created the risk of the material being overwritten or lost before it could be formally preserved. Robert had authorized the request. The recording had arrived through the appropriate legal channels. The attorney had watched the complete video, had identified the most relevant moments for a potential lawsuit, and had made a second call to Robert in which he had said that the recording was clearer than he had expected, that it documented every moment of the interaction in a way that made the reconstruction of the facts practically automatic, and that there was a strategic decision to be made about whether to release the video publicly before or after filing a formal lawsuit. Robert had chosen to release it first because he had reached the conclusion during those 5 days of processing that what had happened at that IHOP had not happened only to him, and that the utility of the video went beyond the individual lawsuit that might result from it. The video had been published on a sharing platform with a factual description of what had happened, without inflammatory language, without asking for anything specific beyond that people watch it. In 48 hours, it had accumulated more than 8 million views. The specific combination of elements in the recording, the birthday, the gold crown, the pancakes with candles, the officer's question to the 6-year-old about whether her father had told her to say what she was saying had created a resonance that transcended political and demographic divisions, that normally fragmented the audience in cases of police discrimination. There was no available ambiguity in that video, in the way there was ambiguity in other cases. There was a child with a birthday crown, and there were cooling pancakes, and there was a police officer asking whether the father had instructed his daughter to lie. The outrage had been broad, immediate, and had come from directions the police department had not anticipated when it had issued its first statement trying to frame the incident as standard procedure in response to an emergency call. The department had attempted, in the days following the publication of the video, to build a public defense based on the narrative that Collins had responded appropriately to a legitimate call and had followed standard verification protocol. That narrative had collapsed in multiple and simultaneous ways. First, because the video showed Collins continuing to question Ayla even after she had responded consistently, and even after the manager had provided additional context, which was inconsistent with any reasonable verification protocol. Second, because the existence of the adoption decree in portable format, which Robert had carried specifically because of the attorney's advice about situations like that one, made the 11-minute verification difficult to justify as necessary rather than punitive. And third, because Patricia and at least 2 other witnesses had given voluntary statements confirming what the camera showed and adding context about what had been observable in the restaurant from before Collins's arrival. Context that made it impossible to argue that any reasonable basis for initial suspicion had existed. Collins had been removed from field duties while the internal investigation was ongoing. In a decision, the department had announced with standard language about commitment to accountability and transparency. The police union had issued a statement of support for Collins that had been received with a reaction the union itself had clearly not anticipated, because the statement had used the language of operational discretion in response to a legitimate call in a context where the video made that language audible in a way that caused it to sound like a defense of something that most people who had watched the video did not consider defensible. The platforms where the video had circulated had transformed that union statement into the second most shared element of the case after the original recording, creating a juxtaposition between institutional language and the body camera images that was more effective as criticism than any additional commentary could have been. The lawsuit was filed in federal court 8 weeks after that birthday breakfast. It was a 96-page document that had been constructed with a structure that experienced attorneys in the field described as one of the most complete they had seen in cases of racial discrimination involving children, because it operated in layers that reinforced each other in a way that closed practically every exit that the defense normally uses in these cases. The first layer established the racial discrimination directly, documented by the body camera that showed the approach without observable justification and by the absence of any behavior by Robert or Ayla that could have motivated the call beyond the racial combination that had been perceived by whoever had called. The second layer argued violation of Robert's constitutional rights, specifically the protection against detention without probable cause, documented by the fact that the 11 minutes of verification had occurred after a judicial document had been presented, and its validity established before any call to the system. The third layer was the most legally innovative and was the one legal commentators had discussed with most attention. It argued specific harm to the child, that Ayla had been subjected to an interrogation conducted by a state agent during which she had been questioned in ways that presumed her father could be a criminal, and that harm was documentable and compensable independently of the harms suffered by Robert. That third layer had been constructed with the assistance of a psychologist specializing in child development and trauma, who had evaluated Ayla in the weeks after the incident and had produced a report documenting the observable effects of that morning on her behavior in the subsequent days. The report described specific changes that the psychologist had attributed, with documented clinical basis, to the experience of having her father separated from her by state agents in a situation she had perceived as threatening without fully understanding why. There were nightmares in the 3 days following the incident. There was a reluctance to accompany her father to public places that had lasted approximately 2 weeks. There were repeated questions about whether her father could be taken away again. None of those effects had been permanent, and the psychologist had documented Ayla's gradual recovery with the same precision with which he had documented the initial effects. But the documentation of the existence of those effects, even if temporary, had created a clinical basis for allegations of harm to the child that made the lawsuit significantly more complex than it would have been if only the harms to Robert were considered. The department had attempted, through its attorneys, to persuade the court that Collins had acted within the limits of qualified immunity because he had responded to an emergency call and had followed what he considered reasonable procedure given the circumstances. That defense had encountered an obstacle that would become central in every preliminary hearing. The body camera showed Collins arriving at the restaurant, locating Robert and Ayla in less than 10 seconds, and walking directly toward them without making any additional observation of the environment, without checking with any employee before approaching, without considering any alternative hypothesis to the one he had brought from the car. That behavior of someone who had arrived with a conclusion and was implementing that conclusion without the evaluationist step the law required before any action that restricted someone's freedom was precisely the behavior that the qualified immunity doctrine did not protect when there was clear evidence that established rights had been violated. The person who had made the original call to the emergency number had been identified through call records during the discovery process. She was a 63-year-old woman who had been sitting at a table 3 booths away from Robert and Ayla. She had been contacted by Robert's attorney as part of the process, had initially refused to answer questions, and had subsequently given a statement through her own attorney that was, in Robert's attorney's assessment, the most direct admission available of how the assumption had functioned. She had said she had seen the girl appear quiet and had become concerned. When asked whether the girl had seemed frightened or in danger in any specific way, she had said not exactly, that it was more of a feeling. When asked whether she had spoken with anyone in the restaurant before calling, she had said no. When asked whether she had considered that the man might be the girl's father, she had been silent for a moment before saying she had not thought of that. That statement, that she had not thought of it, was the most precise description available of the mechanism that had set everything in motion, an assumption, formed so quickly and with such certainty that the most obvious and most common possibility that an adult man accompanying a child in a restaurant might simply be her father had not made it to consideration. Collins was dismissed 5 months after the incident, after the internal investigation concluded that he had conducted the interaction in a way that violated departmental approach protocols and had prolonged Robert's detention beyond what any reasonable justification could sustain after the adoption and documentation had been presented. The union attempted the appeal it always attempts, and the appeal was denied with language the arbitrator had chosen with enough precision to be cited in civil rights organization statements in the weeks that followed. Language that said the body camera had documented not a misjudgment, but a sequence of consecutive decisions, each of which had had an available exit point and none of which had been taken. The agreement that closed the lawsuit was announced 7 months after that birthday breakfast. The financial amount was kept partially confidential, but sources close to the proceedings confirmed it was among the largest ever paid by the county in civil rights cases involving children. The non-financial conditions included complete revision of response protocols for calls involving minors, mandatory training on racial bias and on adoptive and foster families with phenotypically mixed compositions, and the creation of a review mechanism for false calls that had resulted in illegal detention, with the possibility of referral to the prosecutor's office when the discriminatory element could be established. That last condition had been the most difficult to negotiate, and had been the one Robert had defended most firmly, because he had understood from the beginning that the call that had set everything in motion had not been made by Collins, but by someone who had looked at a birthday table and had seen something that did not exist, and that as long as there were no consequences for that kind of call, the cycle that had produced that morning would continue reproducing itself in other restaurants at other tables with other fathers and other children. Robert had returned to the same IHOP with Ayla 2 months after the agreement was signed. He had chosen that restaurant deliberately, had asked for the same window booth table, had ordered the same pancakes, and had brought 2 new candles he had put in his bag before leaving home. The manager who had tried to intervene on that October morning had recognized Robert when he walked in, had walked to the table, had shaken Robert's hand, and had said something that Robert would later describe as the simplest and most necessary thing anyone had said to him throughout that entire process. The manager had said, "Welcome back." Robert had sat in the booth with Ayla, had asked the waiter for the candles, had lit both on a stack of pancakes, and had looked at his daughter. With the crown she had insisted on wearing again, because it was the same crown from last time, and she had said the birthday was not over yet. This time, the candles stayed lit until Ayla blew them out. This time, nobody walked through the door.
Sir, I'm gonna need you to move to economy.
What? This is my seat.
First class is for certain tickets. You're in the wrong section.
My boarding pass says 2A. You scanned it.
I don't think this is right. People don't just end up here.
Oh, so you think I can't afford the VIP? Call your supervisor.
Why?
Because you're about to make this real expensive, buddy.
He had purchased that first-class seat 6 weeks before the flight. It had not been an impulsive purchase or a last-minute decision. It had been planned with the advanced preparation of someone who travels frequently enough to know that the price of a first-class seat on certain routes is worth what it costs, when the alternative is arriving at an important meeting after 8 hours compressed in an economy class row. He had chosen the specific seat on the app, had received the confirmation by email, had checked in online the night before, and had arrived at the boarding gate with enough time to board on the first call. He had done everything that any other first-class passenger does when they buy a ticket and intend to use what they paid for. And then a flight attendant appeared beside his seat and asked him to stand up. The phone in his jacket pocket began recording before he had fully processed what was being asked. That reflex, picking up the phone and documenting when something that should not be happening begins to happen, had become common enough among enough people that the world had accumulated, over recent years, a growing archive of moments that would otherwise exist only in the memory of those who lived them, and in the institutional version of those who caused them. This specific video, recorded in a first-class cabin while the plane was still on the ground, with passengers boarding around it, would become part of that archive in a way the airline had certainly not calculated when the flight attendant made the decision she made. The man sitting in that first-class seat was named Marcus. He was 38 years old, was a senior financial consultant at a firm with offices in 4 countries, and had accumulated over 12 years of career, a level of experience with air travel that most people never develop, because most people do not spend their lives inside airplanes the way he did. He knew boarding protocols, knew passenger rights, knew the difference between a request that has a basis in some operational rule and a request that has no basis beyond the decision of whoever is making it. What the flight attendant had asked him to do, stand up from the seat he had purchased and paid for without any explanation that held up, was clearly the second category. And Marcus knew that with the precision of someone who had spent 12 years learning the difference. The flight attendant had arrived at his seat with that specific posture of institutional authority that exists in uniformed professions, the posture of someone who represents an institution larger than themselves, and who uses that representation as implicit justification for every request they make. She had said there was a problem with his seat. She had not specified what problem. She had said she needed him to stand up while the situation was verified. Marcus had asked for a more specific explanation of what the problem was and what exactly was being verified. The flight attendant had repeated the request without providing the explanation. There were other first-class passengers around them, seated in their seats, with no similar request being made to any of them. Marcus's camera had begun recording at that moment, with the phone positioned in a way that captured the flight attendant, the seat, and the surrounding passengers without it being immediately obvious what was being done. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. What this story reveals about how certain assumptions operate even in spaces where money should be the only relevant criterion will surprise you, and the outcome has a specific number that the airline had clearly not calculated when everything began. Hit subscribe right now and tell me in the comments, have you ever been treated as though you did not belong in a space you had paid to be in? Tell me down below. Marcus did not stand up from the seat. He stayed where he was with the phone recording discreetly and did something the camera captured and that anyone watching the video would recognize as the movement of someone who knows exactly what they are doing. He reached into his jacket pocket, removed the boarding pass, and placed it on the tray in front of him with the seat number visible to the camera. That simple gesture, showing the boarding pass without being asked, communicated several things simultaneously. It communicated that he had the document proving he was in the correct seat. It communicated that he knew the document existed and was relevant. And it communicated, in a way the camera captured with enough clarity to be seen by millions of people in the weeks that followed, that the problem with that seat was not the seat. It was who was in it. Marcus had arrived at that airport that morning with the routine of someone who had made that same journey hundreds of times. He knew where long-term parking was, knew which check-in line moved faster in that specific terminal, knew that the coffee shop on the right side after security had a better espresso than anything served on board, and that it was worth the extra 8 minutes it took to buy and walk to the gate. He had done all of this with the quiet efficiency of someone who no longer needs to think about these steps, because he had executed them enough times for them to become automatic. He had arrived at the gate with coffee in hand, had waited for the priority boarding call, had boarded before most other passengers, had reached his seat, 3A, window, left side of the first-class cabin, and had settled in with that familiar feeling of someone who is exactly where they plan to be. The flight attendant who approached his seat during boarding was named according to the badge. Marcus's camera captured with enough resolution to read Jennifer. She had arrived at 3A with an expression that Marcus would later describe in the statement he gave his attorneys as the expression of someone who had already made a decision before opening their mouth. There was no hesitation in the approach. There was none of the body language of someone bringing information that may be uncomfortable, but that has a clear factual basis. There was the posture of someone who had decided what they needed to happen and was communicating that decision in a way that presumed it would be carried out. The first thing she said was that there was an inconsistency in the seating system, and that she needed Marcus to accompany her to the front of the cabin while the situation was resolved. Marcus had asked her to specify which inconsistency. Jennifer had said the system was showing a double allocation for that seat, and that it was standard procedure to move one of the passengers while the situation was verified. Marcus had then asked the most obvious question available at that moment: why he was being asked to move rather than the other passenger who was supposedly also allocated to the same seat. Jennifer had not answered that question directly. She had repeated that it was standard procedure and that she needed him to accompany her. Marcus had looked around the first-class cabin. There were 4 other passengers already seated, all white, none of them being approached. There were 2 seats still empty, including the seat beside his, 3B. And there was one very simple fact that made the double allocation story immediately questionable. If there was a double allocation at 3A, any airline's standard resolution would be to check the boarding passes of both passengers before asking either one to move. Jennifer had not asked for Marcus's boarding pass. She had asked him to stand up. It was at that moment that Marcus removed the boarding pass from his pocket and placed it on the tray. He pointed to the seat number printed on the card, 3A, and then pointed to the number printed on the seat back in front of him, also 3A, and said with a calm the camera captured as the calm of someone being deliberately clear because they want every word to be comprehensible to anyone who watches what is being recorded, that his boarding pass showed he was in the correct seat and that he was willing to wait in the seat while the supposed inconsistency was verified the way any genuine inconsistency would be verified, by consulting the system and the records, not by asking a passenger to stand up without first checking their documents. Jennifer listened to this with the expression she had brought from the beginning, and that had not changed throughout the interaction up to that point. Then she said something Marcus had not anticipated, and that the camera captured with enough clarity that there was no doubt about what had been said. She said there were other passengers waiting, and that his attitude was delaying the boarding process. The word attitude, said with that specific tone that carries a weight that goes beyond its literal meaning, that suggests the problem is not the situation, but the way the person is responding to the situation, that reframes the person exercising their rights as the obstacle rather than the person violating those rights. Marcus had heard variations of that word, said that way enough times throughout his life to immediately recognize what it was being used to do in that moment. He had not responded with anger. He had responded with a question, asking whether Jennifer could call the cabin supervisor because he would like a supervisor to be present while the situation was resolved. That request for supervision had produced in Jennifer's expression a change the camera captured and that anyone watching would describe as the moment it became clear that the situation was moving out of the control she had presumed to have over it. The cabin supervisor arrived 2 minutes later. His name was Robert. He had the kind of posture of someone with more years of service and more experience in the conflict situations with passengers than Jennifer, and he had arrived with the expression of someone who did not yet know what he was walking into, but knew he needed to assess before acting. Marcus explained the situation sequentially and factually, showed the boarding pass, pointed to the seat, and then did something Robert had not anticipated. He turned the phone and showed that a recording had been in progress since the beginning of the interaction, not as a threat, as information. Robert's expression at that moment, captured by the camera Marcus had just revealed was recording, was the second most analyzed moment of the entire video when it became public weeks later. Because it was the expression of someone simultaneously processing what had happened, what was recorded, and what that meant for everything that would happen from that point forward. Robert was silent for perhaps 5 seconds after Marcus revealed the recording. 5 seconds that the camera captured with the ambient sound of the plane in the background, the sound of passengers still boarding through economy class, bags being stowed in overhead compartments, the normalcy of a regular boarding serving as sonic contrast to that pause happening in the first-class cabin. When Robert spoke, the tone had shifted from what Marcus had described of Jennifer's arrival. There was in it a carefulness that was not necessarily empathy, but was the carefulness of someone who understands that every word spoken from that moment forward is being recorded and will need to be defensible. He asked for Marcus's boarding pass. Marcus handed it over. Robert examined it, verified the seat number, and then did something Jennifer had not done at any point in the prior interaction. He checked the system on the tablet he was carrying and confirmed out loud that seat 3A was correctly allocated to Marcus's name. That confirmation, spoken by Robert out loud and captured by the camera with enough clarity to be transcribed, was the logical end of the situation. The seat was correct. The passenger was in the right seat. There was no double allocation. The story that had been used to justify the request for Marcus to stand up had been verified and had turned out to be non-existent. In any reasonable sequence of events, that would have been the moment Robert apologized for the confusion, returned the boarding pass, and continued with the boarding process. But what happened next was not that, and what happened next was what transformed an incident that could have been closed at that moment into a process that would cost the airline a seven-figure amount and produce one of the most watched recordings of the year in that segment of discrimination cases. Jennifer had been standing beside Robert during the verification. When he confirmed that the seat was correctly allocated, she said, something the camera captured, and that Robert had clearly not anticipated she would say at that moment. She said that other passengers had reported feeling uncomfortable with Marcus's presence in the cabin and that the company's protocol allowed for the reallocation of passengers in situations where the comfort and safety of other passengers were a concern. That allegation, that other passengers had reported discomfort, appeared for the first time at that moment of the interaction, had not been mentioned during any of the prior approaches. And there was a very simple reason for that which anyone watching the video would immediately identify. It had been constructed in real time as a response to the fact that the double allocation story had collapsed. It was a second narrative being created at the moment the first one had stopped working. Marcus pointed that out explicitly, and the camera captured every word. He said that the allegation of other passengers' discomfort had not been mentioned at any prior point in the interaction, and asked which passengers specifically had reported that discomfort and when that report had been made. Jennifer did not provide any specific names. She said she could not disclose other passengers' information. Marcus then asked whether Robert could verify whether there was any record in the system of any passenger having made that request before or during boarding, before the initial approach. Robert went to check. Marcus stayed in the seat. The camera kept recording. There were other first-class passengers who could hear that conversation from their seats, and at least two of them had turned their heads in the direction of 3A with expressions the camera captured in the background, expressions that were unambiguously the expressions of people who were hearing something that was surprising them. Robert returned 3 minutes later with an expression that had changed perceptibly from the one he had when he left to check. There was in him now something that was not exactly discomfort, but was adjacent to it, the expression of someone who has just found information that makes the situation they are in more complicated than they had imagined when they got involved in it. He said there was no record in the system of any passenger having reported discomfort before or during boarding. He said Marcus's seat was confirmed, and he said, with that verbal carefulness of someone trying to close a situation without explicitly admitting what the situation implied, that Marcus was free to remain in his seat and that he was sorry for the confusion. Jennifer was standing beside him when he said that. The camera captured her expression during those words. It was not the expression of someone who had just understood they had made a mistake. It was the expression of someone who had not yet arrived at that conclusion. What happened in the following 10 minutes was captured by Marcus's camera in fragments, because he had lowered the phone after Robert's confirmation, but had left the recording active in his pocket, capturing audio of sufficient quality to be relevant. Jennifer had stepped away after Robert's words, but had returned to 3A 2 more times during the remainder of boarding, once under the pretext of checking whether Marcus needed anything, and once with no articulated pretext, simply pausing briefly beside the seat with the posture the camera had captured from the beginning. Each of those interactions had been brief and without additional incident, but the camera had recorded their frequency in a way that Marcus's attorneys would later describe as documentation of a pattern of behavior that went beyond the initial episode, and that was relevant to characterizing what had happened in that cabin as something systematic rather than an isolated moment of poor judgment. The plane landed at Marcus's destination 5 hours and 40 minutes after boarding. During that time, the first-class service had been conducted by Jennifer and a second flight attendant, and the difference between how Marcus had been served and how the other passengers in the same cabin had been served was documentable through the audio the pocket camera had captured intermittently during the flight. It was not a dramatic difference. There was no additional incident that compared to what had happened during boarding. It was a difference in details, in the frequency of check-ins, in the tone of interactions, in the speed with which requests were attended to. It was the kind of difference that each individual passenger experiences subjectively, and that normally leaves no verifiable record. But the camera had captured enough fragments of those details that, when analyzed together, they established a line of continuity between what had happened during boarding and what had continued, happening over the following 5 hours. Marcus had spent part of the flight with his phone on the tray in front of him, open on a document where he had begun recording every detail of the incident, with the precision of someone who knows that memory is fallible and that contemporaneous documentation carries different weight than subsequent reconstruction. He had noted the approximate times of each interaction with Jennifer during boarding, had described the content of each exchange, had noted the names visible on the badges, had documented the absence of any system record confirmed by Robert, and had recorded the 2 additional visits Jennifer had made to his seat after the situation had nominally been resolved. That document, created on board the plane while the details were still immediate, would become one of the most important corroborating pieces of the lawsuit that would develop in the weeks that followed. Because it had been created before any strategic consideration about the case could have influenced what was included or excluded. When the plane landed and passengers began disembarking, Marcus stayed in his seat until most of the other first-class passengers had left. Not out of hesitation. For a specific reason he had decided during the flight. He wanted to document the state of the seat and the surrounding space before leaving, including the boarding pass he had placed on the tray during boarding, and that had remained there visibly throughout the flight. The camera captured that final moment in the cabin, the empty seat beside him, the boarding pass with 3A printed on it, and the first-class cabin, with the specific quality of a space being left behind. It was an image without drama, but with a documentary completeness that Marcus's attorneys would value when the body of evidence was analyzed for the first time. Marcus contacted a law firm specializing in racial discrimination and consumer rights the morning after the flight. He had researched the night. Before, had identified a firm with a specific track record in cases against airlines, and had sent an email at 11 at night with a detailed description of the incident and a direct question about whether there was legal basis for a lawsuit. The response had arrived at 6 the following morning, which was itself an indicator of how the firm had assessed what it had received. The attorney who responded had said she needed to see the recording before making any formal assessment, but that the description Marcus had provided, if corroborated by the video, described a set of facts that fell into multiple categories of violation of federal anti-discrimination legislation applicable to air carriers. The recording was sent that morning. The formal assessment arrived the following day. The attorney had watched the video 3 times, had shared it with 2 colleagues at the firm who had watched it independently, and all had reached the same conclusion. The recording showed a sequence of events that supported with direct and verifiable evidence allegations of racial discrimination in a public transportation service, which was a specific category of legal protection with established jurisprudence and a history of cases that had resulted in significant settlements when the evidence was sufficiently clear. The evidence in this case was, in the firm's assessment, clearer than in most cases they had conducted. The camera had captured the initial approach, had captured the double allocation story being presented without basis, had captured the story of other passengers' discomfort being created in real time after the first had collapsed, and had captured Robert's confirmation that neither narrative had support in the system. It was a documented progression of 2 false allegations used sequentially to attempt to remove a black passenger from a first-class seat that had been legally purchased and paid for. The airline was formally notified of the intent to sue 15 days. After the flight, the notification included a detailed description of the incident, the names of the employees involved as identified in the recording and flight records, and a specific reference to the existence of video material documenting the interaction. There was also a very clear instruction that any attempt to access, alter, or destroy internal records related to the flight, including seat allocation system logs, onboard communications records, and any documentation related to interactions with Marcus during that specific flight, would be treated as obstruction with all applicable legal consequences. The firm had learned in prior cases that airlines have automatic archiving systems that overwrite operational logs in relatively short windows, and that the explicit notification about evidence preservation needed to arrive before those automatic processes created a loss that would afterward be difficult to distinguish from deliberate destruction. The airline responded to the formal notification 12 days after receiving it through a letter signed by the legal department that followed the standard structure of institutional responses to litigation threats. Formal acknowledgement of receipt of the notification, declaration of commitment to internal investigation, and language about the company's values regarding equal treatment of all passengers, constructed in a way that sounded like accountability without admitting any specific fact. Marcus's attorney had seen variations of that letter enough times to know what it communicated beyond what was written. The company had assessed the situation enough to understand it needed time before deciding how to respond substantively, and was using the language of internal investigation as a mechanism to create that time without committing to any specific legal position. The lawsuit was filed in federal court 22 days after the notification, when it became clear that the internal investigation the company had promised had not produced any substantive communication, and that the time created by the initial response was being used to build a defense rather than resolve the situation. The filed document was 84 pages long and had been constructed with a specificity that reflected the quality of the available evidence. Each allegation was anchored in a verifiable moment of the recording with specific timestamps and transcriptions of the captured audio. The progression of the two false narratives, first the double allocation and then the discomfort of other passengers, was documented in a way that showed not only that the allegations were false, but that the second had appeared immediately after. The first had been disproved by the company's own supervisor, which established an intent to find any available justification to remove Marcus from the seat, regardless of the factual validity of that justification. The company had done, in the weeks between the notification and the filing of the lawsuit, something that Marcus's attorneys had anticipated but hoped not to have to confront. It had attempted to contact Robert, the cabin supervisor, through internal channels and had held at least one meeting with him that had not been spontaneously disclosed, but had been discovered during the discovery process when internal communications records were formally requested. That meeting had occurred 12 days after Marcus's notification, which was also the same day the company's formal response had been sent. The coincidence of dates had been noted by Marcus's attorneys and had become part of a line of questioning during depositions that produced responses from Robert that were, in the most charitable interpretation, carefully imprecise about the content of what had been discussed in that meeting. Jennifer had been removed from flight duties 2 weeks after the filing of the lawsuit, in a decision the company had described internally as an administrative measure during the investigation, but that had been communicated externally in a way sufficiently ambiguous not to confirm any acknowledgement of responsibility. That ambiguity had been deliberate and had been noted by both Marcus's attorneys and the journalists who had begun following the case after the existence of the video became public knowledge. The recording had reached the press not through any action by Marcus or his attorneys, but through a source close to the case who had shared the video with a reporter who covered cases of racial discrimination in public transportation services. When the video was published, the reaction had been immediate and had followed the pattern that videos of that kind produce when the evidence is sufficiently clear: broad outrage, extensive coverage, and pressure on the company that made each subsequent public statement more difficult to formulate than the previous one. The company had attempted, in the days following the publication of the video, to produce a narrative about the incident that acknowledged what was visible in the recording without admitting discrimination. It had spoken about a communication failure, about procedures that would be revised, about the company's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Each of those statements had been analyzed in parallel with the specific moments of the recording that contradicted the language used, and that analysis had circulated on the same platforms that had amplified the video, creating a layer of public fact-checking that made the company's communication strategy progressively less effective with each attempt. The public that had watched the video had seen Jennifer create a second narrative in real time after the first had collapsed. When the company created public narratives about communication failure, the memory of that specific moment made those narratives difficult to receive without skepticism. Depositions began 6 weeks after the filing of the lawsuit. Jennifer was deposed first, and what was recorded in that session was the kind of testimony that legal practitioners describe as involuntary documentation, because the answers she gave to questions about each specific moment of the recording were systematically inconsistent with what the camera showed in a way that could not be attributed to isolated memory lapses, but that configured a pattern of reconstruction of events that diverged from the recorded evidence at precisely the points most relevant to the lawsuit's central allegations. About the double allocation, she had said she had received the information from a colleague before boarding, but had been unable to identify which colleague or at what specific moment that communication had occurred. About the allegation of other passengers' discomfort, she had said it was her perception, based on the body language of surrounding passengers, which was a completely different version from what she had said during the interaction, when she had stated that passengers had actively reported the discomfort. Each of those inconsistencies was documented by Marcus's recording on one side and by Jennifer's own deposition on the other, and the juxtaposition of the two sources was, in the assessment of the attorneys present, sufficiently clear to dispense with any additional argument about the credibility of the version Jennifer was attempting to construct. The agreement was announced on a Tuesday morning, 4 months and 18 days after that flight. The number that leaked before the official confirmation, and that was confirmed by sources close to the proceedings when the press began reporting, had 7 digits. It was not the highest amount ever paid by an airline in a racial discrimination case, but it was among the most significant of the last decade in that specific category. And what made it notable was not only the amount itself, but the context in which it had been reached. A process that had lasted less than 5 months from filing to agreement, at a speed that indicated the company had assessed the risk of going to trial with that recording as central evidence and had reached a conclusion that made any settlement amount preferable to the potential cost of a jury watching the complete video in a courtroom. Marcus's attorney had negotiated the agreement with a clarity about what was and was not negotiable that she would later describe in an interview with a specialized legal publication as the result of having evidence solid enough not to need to make concessions that would weaken what the case represented beyond the individual client's interest. The financial amount had been discussed with Marcus from the beginning as secondary to the institutional conditions, not because the money did not matter, but because Marcus had been explicit from the first consultation that the outcome he wanted from the process was an outcome that changed something beyond his bank account. He had told his attorney in one of the first meetings that there were people who went through the same experience in that same type of seat on that same type of plane without a camera and without the resources to hire the right firm, and that the process needed to produce something that existed beyond that specific flight. The institutional conditions of the agreement reflected that determination with a specificity that Marcus's attorney had insisted be verifiable and not merely declarative. Jennifer was dismissed as a condition of the agreement, not transferred, not suspended for a fixed period, dismissed, with a notation in her employment record that prevented rehire in any passenger-facing role at airlines that shared the industry's human resources database. Robert received a 90-day suspension without pay and was required to complete a training program on racial bias and on the obligation to intervene when witnessing discriminatory conduct, with documented verification of completion. The company was required to completely revise its seat reallocation protocols, creating a system that required verifiable documentation of any systemic problem before any reallocation request could be made to a passenger, and that automatically recorded each reallocation request with the name of the employee who had made it and the time at which it had been made. That last condition, the automatic recording of reallocation. Requests was the one that passenger rights specialists who followed the agreement described as potentially most impactful in the long term because it created an accountability infrastructure that did not depend on any specific passenger having a camera or having resources to sue the company. Each reallocation request would be recorded with enough information for patterns of discriminatory behavior to be identifiable through data analysis over time, even when no individual incident had sufficient evidence to sustain an isolated lawsuit. It was a systemic change of a nature that individual lawsuits rarely produce, and had been negotiated with the precision of someone who had understood from the beginning that the camera had given Marcus an opportunity that most people do not have, and that using that opportunity to create something larger than an individual settlement was the only proportional response to the responsibility that opportunity created. Marcus issued a public statement on the day the agreement was confirmed. It was short, 5 paragraphs, and had been written by him without attorney involvement in the drafting, although it had been reviewed by them before publication. He did not describe the settlement amount. He did not describe Jennifer or Robert by name. He used no language that suggested personal satisfaction with the outcome beyond the acknowledgement that it was a fair result. What he described, with a clarity that recalled the calm with which he had shown the boarding pass in that cabin months earlier, was what he had learned throughout that process about the difference between cases that produce change and cases that produce only compensation. He had said that difference was not in the severity of the discrimination suffered, because there were people who experienced equally severe or more severe discrimination without a camera and without an attorney. It was in the resources available to transform the experience into evidence, and the evidence into process, and the process into conditions that existed after the process ended. And he had said that as long as that difference existed, every person with access to those resources had a responsibility about how they used them that went beyond their interest in their own case. Seat 3A on that specific plane had been occupied by other passengers in the months between Marcus's flight and the agreement. The company had continued operating that route, that plane had continued flying, and the life of that first-class cabin had continued with the normalcy of spaces where significant incidents happen and leave marks that are not visible on the surface. But there was now, recorded in the company's system by legal obligation resulting from the agreement, a protocol that had not existed before. Marcus sat in that seat and Jennifer appeared beside him with that decision already made. Every reallocation request made from that agreement forward was being recorded with name, time, and documented justification. It was a small change relative to the size of the problem it represented, but it was a real, verifiable change that existed independently of any public attention or media pressure, and that had been created because a man had purchased a first-class seat, had paid what had been asked, and had arrived at the airport with a phone in his pocket and the reflex to press record when something that should not be happening begins to happen.
Drop the weapon. Put your hands where I can see them.
What weapon? This is my walking stick. I'm blind.
Don't play games with me. I know a club when I see one.
Sir, I have a white cane. I'm visually impaired.
Right, and I'm supposed to believe that?
He was walking along the sidewalk with the white cane in his hand, making the characteristic lateral movement that anyone who knows someone with a visual impairment immediately recognizes, that low and rhythmic arc that serves to map the space ahead and navigate the world without seeing it. It was a November afternoon. The sky was blue and clear over that busy commercial street, and there were people around coming and going in their own directions without anything in that scene suggesting any kind of problem. The man with the white cane was doing exactly what any person does on a public sidewalk on an ordinary afternoon. He was moving from one point to another with the assistance of the only instrument that made that movement possible for him. And then a police officer appeared in front of him, and the body camera that officer carried on his chest began recording something that, when it reached the right hands, would be impossible to defend. The body camera recorded everything from 3:27 in the afternoon on November 6th, 2024. It recorded the sidewalk, recorded the commercial establishments in the background, recorded the cars parked on the street, and recorded, with a clarity that left no room for any alternative interpretation, the white cane in the hand of the man being approached. That white cane was visible from the very first second of the recording. It did not appear later. It was not taken from somewhere during the interaction. It was there, in the camera's field of view, from the moment the officer got close enough that anyone with normal vision could identify it without any difficulty. And yet, what followed in the minutes after that first second was something that disability rights organizations, civil attorneys, and millions of people who watched the video in the weeks that followed described with the same words: incomprehensible. The man with the white cane was named James. He was 42 years old, had lost his vision gradually over a decade as the result of a degenerative medical condition, and had developed over that process the functional independence that visually impaired people build, with a combination of specific training, assistive technology, and the practical acceptance that the world was built for people who can see, and that navigating that world requires constant adaptation. He knew that street. He had walked that stretch dozens of times, knew how many steps there were between the bus stop and the entrance of the store he was going to visit, knew how the sidewalk changed texture at a certain corner, and carried the mental map of that neighborhood with the precision of someone who depends on spatial memory in a way that sighted people rarely need to develop. The officer who approached James that afternoon had been dispatched, according to the official account, that would be questioned in every detail in the weeks that followed, following a call reporting a man with suspicious behavior on that sidewalk. The description that had motivated the call, and that the officer had received over the radio before arriving at the scene, was vague enough to apply to any person within a radius of several blocks. But there was one element in the scene that made the suggestion of suspicious behavior not just unlikely, but actively absurd to anyone who arrived on that sidewalk with open eyes and no previously formed assumptions: the white cane. There was nothing ambiguous about that object. There was no second interpretation available. It was a white cane in the hands of a man in dark glasses on a public sidewalk, and it communicated with the precision of a universally recognized symbol that the person carrying it could not see. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. This story becomes progressively harder to believe as the details unfold, and you are going to want to follow it to the end, because the outcome says something important about what happens when evidence is clear enough to not be ignored. Hit subscribe right now and tell me in the comments, can you imagine being approached by a police officer for walking down the street with your own cane? Tell me down below. The video the body camera produced that November afternoon would become, in the weeks that followed, one of the most watched and most discussed recordings in the debate about abuse of authority and racial discrimination in the United States during that period. Not because it was the most violent case that had appeared in that debate, but because it contained a combination of elements that made it impossible to construct any defense that would not immediately collapse upon contact with the images. A black man, a white cane visible from the first second, and a police officer who had decided that none of those elements altered the course of action he had predetermined before arriving on the sidewalk. That combination, recorded in high definition with the date and time in the upper right corner of the screen, was what cost the officer everything he had built over years of service. James had left home that afternoon with a simple and specific goal. There was a musical instrument store 6 blocks from the apartment where he lived, and he had called that morning to confirm that the item he had ordered had arrived. The employee who answered had confirmed it, had given an estimated time when the store would be less busy, and James had planned his outing with the kind of advanced preparation that visually impaired people develop as a habit, because each independent trip requires a level of planning that goes beyond what most people need to consider. He knew the route, had checked on his phone's accessibility app whether there were any interruptions or construction along the way, had left with enough time not to need to quicken his pace, and had arrived on that commercial street without incident until the moment the officer appeared in front of him. The officer's name was Officer Brett Larson. He had 9 years of service in the department, had worked that commercial zone for 3 of the last 4 years, and knew that street with the familiarity of someone who had patrolled it in different shifts and weather conditions over hundreds of working days. That detail, that Larson knew that street, was relevant because it made even less sustainable any argument that he was unfamiliar with the kind of movement visually impaired people make on a public sidewalk, or that there was some characteristic of James's navigation with the cane that could legitimately seem suspicious to someone with patrol experience in that specific environment. There were visually impaired people who regularly frequented that commercial street. The white cane was not an unusual object in that context. It was simply a white cane. The call that had dispatched Larson had been made by a shopkeeper whose establishment was half a block from where James was when the officer arrived. The shopkeeper had described a black man walking erratically on the sidewalk and potentially disturbing customers. That description would later be contested by at least 4 people who were on the street at that moment, and who would give statements confirming that James had walked along the sidewalk without disturbing anyone, without approaching any establishment beyond the one he was going to visit, and without any behavior that could reasonably be described as erratic by any objective standard. Navigation with a white cane has a specific appearance that can look different from the walking pattern of a sighted person, but that any basic training in interacting with people with disabilities teaches you to immediately recognize. What the shopkeeper had described as erratic was simply the way James walked. Larson arrived at the scene and saw James walking on the sidewalk with the cane. The body camera captured that moment with a clarity that would make that first second of the recording the most analyzed of the entire video in the weeks that followed, because it was the moment that it established what Larson had seen before, saying or doing anything. The cane was visible. The characteristic movement with it was visible. The dark glasses James was wearing, which in combination with the white cane, composed an image whose interpretation should not have required any deductive effort, were visible. Larson stopped James and began asking questions in the tone the camera captured as the tone of someone who arrived with a conclusion and is collecting information to support it, not to evaluate it. That distinction between investigating and confirming what has already been decided was audible in every question Larson asked in those first minutes. James responded with the calm of someone who has been caught off guard, but who has enough experience with the world to quickly understand the nature of what is happening. He identified himself, explained where he was going, mentioned the musical instrument store and the item he had ordered. He held the white cane in a way the camera showed clearly, not because he was trying to use it as proof of something, but simply because it was what he was carrying and what he needed to continue walking when that conversation ended. Larson looked at the cane. The camera recorded that look. And then Larson did something that none of the people who watched the video afterward could explain with any logic that held up. He asked James to put the cane on the ground. That request that a blind man place on the ground, the only instrument that allowed him to navigate independently in that space, was the moment the recording became something that transcended the specific case of James and Larson and became a document of something broader and more disturbing. It was not merely a misjudgment. It was not merely a poorly conducted approach. It was a request that only made sense if the person who made it had decided, at some level, the camera could not record, but that the actions made inferable, that no visible element in that scene altered. The narrative he had brought with him to that sidewalk. The white cane was there. The request was made anyway. And James, who could not see Larson's expression, but who could hear every word and every tone with the auditory acuity developed through years of sensory compensation, understood in that moment that the conversation he was having had nothing to do with anything he had done. James did not put the cane on the ground. He explained, with a patience the camera captured, and that anyone watching the video would recognize as the exhausting kind of patience that develops when you spend years having to explain the existence of your own disability to people who should know but do not, that the cane was a mobility instrument and that putting it on the ground was not something he could do without compromising his ability to remain oriented in that space. He said this directly and without aggression, the way someone explains something they consider obvious but is willing to articulate once because the situation demands it. Larson heard the explanation and made the request again. The camera recorded that sequence, James's explanation and Larson's repetition of the request, with a clarity that made it impossible to argue afterward that there had been some communication failure or misunderstanding about what was being said by each party. What Larson did next was the moment that would become the center of all subsequent coverage of the case, and that would be reproduced billions of times on digital platforms in the weeks that followed. He reached for James's cane, did not ask again, did not wait. He extended his hand and attempted to remove the cane from James's hands, who instinctively held it more firmly, because removing the cane from a blind person's hands in a public space removes their capacity for independent orientation. And anyone who spends a day training mobility with visual impairment understands this in a way that someone who has never experienced it cannot completely imagine. James held onto the cane. Larson interpreted that as resistance, and the camera captured every second of that sequence with a fidelity that left no room for any alternative narrative about what had happened. The situation escalated in a period of time. The camera's timestamp would record as less than 90 seconds between the first request to put the cane on the ground and the moment Larson called for backup over the radio. The backup call was described over the radio as a resistant individual who was refusing to comply with orders and who might represent a risk to public safety. That description, which reached the ears of every agent who responded to the call before they arrived at the scene, was the same dynamic that had appeared in other cases examined on this channel. The narrative transmitted over the radio defined how every person who arrived would process what they found, regardless of what was actually happening at the location. What was actually happening was a blind man holding his own cane on a public sidewalk. What would reach the ears of the backup agents was a description of danger. 3 people who were on the sidewalk at that moment stopped when they saw what was happening. 2 of them took out their phones and began recording. That decision, made independently by 2 strangers who did not know each other, but who simultaneously recognized that they were witnessing something that needed to be documented, produced 2 additional angles of the same scene that would complement Larson's body camera in ways his legal team had certainly not anticipated when the situation began. One of the recordings captured the scene from a lateral angle that clearly showed the white cane standing out against the gray sidewalk, making it even more impossible to argue that the object was not immediately identifiable. The other recorded from a slightly elevated angle that showed James's expression throughout the interaction, an expression that anyone watching would describe as the expression of someone processing the reality of a situation that should not be happening but is. Backup arrived in 4 minutes. 2 additional agents who had received Larson's radio description and who arrived with the posture of people informed that there was active resistance. When they saw the scene, when their own eyes did the work that Larson's body camera had already done 4 minutes earlier, something should have changed. The white cane was visible to them in the same way it had been visible to Larson. James's dark glasses were visible. The nature of the situation was visible. One of the backup agents, whose name was not released during the initial investigation, but who was identified later, paused when he arrived at the scene in a hesitation the camera on his chest recorded as perhaps 3 seconds long. 3 seconds during which he assessed what he was seeing with his own eyes before the group dynamic and the narrative he had received over the radio took over. He did not intervene. He followed the implicit protocol of supporting the colleague who had initiated the approach. That decision not to intervene, when there was clear reason to question what was happening, would become a separate element of the subsequent investigation. James was detained on that sidewalk. He was guided by the arms by 2 agents to the patrol car with the white cane being carried separately by Larson as though it were a seized object, which produced in the body camera an image that would be described by disability rights specialists as one of the most disturbing representations of institutional abuse they had seen documented on video, because the separation between James and his cane was not merely symbolic, it was functional. It was the removal of a blind person's capacity for independent orientation, executed by a state agent in a public space, recorded on body camera, and impossible to frame as anything other than what it was. James was detained for 48 minutes. That number, which the body camera and the department's dispatch records documented with precision, would become one of the most cited details when the case gained public attention, because it represented 48 minutes during which a blind man was separated from the cane that was his primary mobility instrument in a patrol car, with no charge that held up and no explanation that made sense to anyone who had watched the first seconds of the recording. During that time, the musical instrument store where James was supposed to have arrived in the early afternoon was open. The employee who had confirmed the order that morning was waiting, and the item James had ordered was on the counter. None of those circumstances had changed. What had changed was that James was in a patrol car instead of covering the last blocks of the route he had planned so carefully that morning. The release process began when a supervisor arrived at the scene and assessed the situation with her own eyes. The supervisor was Sergeant Patricia Howell, with 18 years of service, and she had arrived not in response to Larson's backup call, but because her patrol route that afternoon passed through that commercial street and she had seen the patrol car stopped with lights on and 2 agents on the sidewalk. When Howell approached and was briefed on the situation by Larson, she immediately requested access to the body camera to review what had been recorded. That review lasted less than 3 minutes. When it ended, Howell instructed Larson to release James immediately, return the cane, and document the incident completely. Larson's expression during that instruction was captured on Howell's body camera, which she had activated upon arriving at the scene per standard protocol, and it was the expression of someone who had not yet fully processed why the situation was being ended the way it was being ended. James was released with the cane returned, and with no formal explanation of what had justified the detention in the first place. Howell approached him after Larson had stepped away and attempted to offer an explanation the camera captured as a genuine attempt to do something that protocol had not prepared her to do in that specific situation. She said there had been a misunderstanding, that she was sorry for the inconvenience, and that James was free to continue on his way. James listened to that in silence for a moment. Then he asked a question that Howell had not anticipated and that the camera captured with audio clear enough to be transcribed afterward. He asked for the name and identification number of every agent who had participated in the detention. It was not an aggressive question. It was a question asked with the precise calm of someone who had decided, during those 48 minutes in the patrol car, what they were going to do when they got out of it. Howell provided the information. James recorded it on his phone using the voice system he used to type, a system the camera captured functioning while James held the phone in a specific way. Another visual detail that anyone watching the video would recognize as yet another confirmation that they were looking at a visually impaired person using assistive technology. That moment, James recording the agents' names and numbers through the voice system while Howell watched, had an almost documentary quality that several legal commentators would note when the video became public. It was the moment the situation turned, when the person who had been treated as a suspect was clearly taking the steps that would transform that afternoon into something with permanent consequences for the people involved. The two recordings made by bystanders on the sidewalk had continued during part of the detention and continued during the release. One of them captured the moment the cane was returned to James, and that specific moment would become perhaps the most shared image of the entire case in the weeks that followed, because it contained a visual economy that communicated everything that needed to be communicated without any additional narration. The cane returning to James's hands, his posture shifting slightly as his fingers wrapped around the familiar handle. The reorientation movement he made immediately afterward, the low rhythmic arc beginning again, mapping the surrounding space after 48 minutes without that information. Anyone watching that moment understood, viscerally and immediately, what had been removed and what had been returned, and understood also, with the same immediacy, what could never be completely returned. The musical instrument store was closed when James arrived there 22 minutes after being released. He had called while walking the final blocks, but the employee who had answered that morning had finished his shift, and whoever was now answering had not been informed of the order. James stood on the sidewalk in front of the store for a few minutes, cane in hand, processing the end of an afternoon that had begun with a planned route and an item waiting on the counter. He had not gotten what he had left home to find. He had lost 48 minutes that could not be recovered, and he had in hand the names and identification numbers of the agents who had made that afternoon what it had been. The store would be open the next day. The process he was about to begin would take longer than that. But James had learned over a decade of adapting to a progressive disability that the time necessary to do the right things rarely corresponds to the time you had planned to use. The video reached social media 48 hours after the incident. One of the two bystanders who had recorded the scene on the sidewalk had hesitated before publishing, not for lack of conviction about what he had documented, but because he had spent those 48 hours trying to decide whether there was any way for that recording to exist in the public space without the unpredictable consequences that videos of that kind sometimes produce. He had watched what he had recorded dozens of times, had shown it to people close to him, had received back the same assessment he had arrived at alone, that what was in that video needed to be seen. He published on a Saturday afternoon with a simple caption that described what had happened without editorializing, without inflaming, just the facts in sequence. The video was 93 seconds long. In 12 hours, it had 2 million views. The speed with which that video spread said something about what it contained that resonated, immediately and across very different audiences. It was not only the outrage at James's treatment, although that outrage was real and intense. It was the white cane. It was the specificity of that symbol and the absolute clarity of what it communicated, and the contrast between that clarity and what the officer had done anyway. People who had no direct experience with visual impairment understood what a white cane meant. people who had direct experience, either as visually impaired people or as family members, saw in the video something that went beyond that specific incident and that touched on a kind of vulnerability that existed at the intersection of disability and race in a way that had rarely been documented with such clarity. Disability rights organizations were the first to issue formal statements, and they came with a technical specificity that complemented the emotional reaction of the general audience. Those organizations described what Larson had done in precise legal terms, citing specific violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which prohibits discrimination based on disability by public agents and establishes very clear obligations about how government institutions must interact with people with disabilities in public spaces. They pointed out that removing or attempting to remove a mobility instrument from a person with a disability without legal justification is a documentable violation of that legislation that exists independently of any other allegation of abuse of authority or racial discrimination. James's case was not only a case of discriminatory policing, it was also a case of violation of federally protected rights of a specific category that created an additional legal pathway with its own liability structure. Civil rights organizations joined the statements in the following 24 hours, and the combination of the two fronts created pressure on the department that was qualitatively different from the pressure that individual cases of police abuse normally generate. Because there were two different sets of federal legislation being invoked simultaneously, and the department needed to respond to both in a way that did not create contradiction between the responses. Any statement that tried to minimize the racial issue compromised the response to the disability issue, and vice versa. And any attempt to argue that Larson had acted in good faith or within the limits of operational discretion collided with the fact that the body camera showed the white cane from the first second, which made any argument about insufficient information impossible to sustain. The department issued a statement 48 hours after the video had gone viral. It was the kind of statement departments issue when they need to say something, but are not ready to say what they need to say, full of language about institutional values and commitment to fair and transparent investigation, with no specific acknowledgement of what the recording showed and no mention of the white cane that was at the center of everything. That statement was received with a reaction the department had probably not anticipated in its extent. It was read as evidence that the institution had not yet made the most basic assessment of what was recorded on its own agent's body camera, because anyone who had made that assessment could not produce that statement without mentioning the cane. The statement generated more negative reaction than silence would have generated, which was a clear indicator that the communication strategy had failed before it was even fully executed. James had retained a law firm specializing in civil rights and disability rights 3 days after the incident, before the video went viral, but after doing enough research to identify who had experience in both fields simultaneously. When the video became public and the pressure on the department began accumulating in a way that anyone following the case could measure, James's attorneys had contacted the department through the appropriate formal channels, informing them that a lawsuit was being prepared, and that any destruction, editing, or loss of evidence material, including all body camera recordings of the incident, would be treated as obstruction with all applicable legal consequences. That notification had reached the department before the public statement, which meant that when the statement was issued, the department already knew a lawsuit was coming, and that the recordings were being preserved by legal obligation. The vague statement they had issued in that context communicated even more clearly than it would have under normal circumstances that the institution had not yet decided how to deal with what it knew was recorded. Larson was placed on paid administrative leave the week after the video went viral, which was technically an administrative measure and not a punishment, but which the department had learned from the public reaction to its previous statements needed to be announced with language that acknowledged the gravity of what had happened, rather than framing it as routine procedure. The announcement of the suspension explicitly mentioned the body camera and what it had documented, which was a significant change from the initial statement that had avoided mentioning the white cane. That shift in language between the first statement and the suspension announcement was, for anyone who had followed the case from the beginning, a clear indicator that the department had finally watched the video through the eyes of someone who needed to respond publicly for what was in it, and had understood that the distance between the vague language of the first statement and the reality of the recording was unsustainable. The internal investigation was conducted over 6 weeks by a group that included, at the insistence of James's firm, as a condition for not accelerating the federal lawsuit immediately, an independent external reviewer with no ties to the department. That condition had been negotiated in the first days after Larson's suspension, when the department had made contact with James's attorneys signaling interest in resolution before formal proceedings. James's attorneys had agreed to keep the lawsuit in preparation rather than filing it immediately, but only under specific conditions that included the external reviewer, complete access to all recordings, including the backup agent's cameras, and access to Larson's complete complaint history over the previous 9 years. The department had agreed to all 3 conditions, which was itself an indicator of the internal assessment they had made about the strength of their position. Larson's complaint history revealed during the investigation had 4 entries prior to the incident with James. 2 had been filed after summary investigation, with no substantive details in the record. 1 had resulted in mandatory additional training that the records showed had been completed on paper, but with no verification that it had produced any documentable behavioral change. The 4th, which had occurred 18 months before the incident with James, involved an approach to a person with a hearing impairment that had been described by the complainant as disrespectful, and based on incorrect assumptions about the person's behavior, and had been filed with a note that the agent had received verbal guidance. That 4th complaint was the most relevant to James's lawsuit because it established that the department had previously been informed that Larson had a specific pattern of difficulty in interactions with people with disabilities and had responded with verbal guidance rather than substantive intervention. What had happened with James was, in his attorney's reading, the direct and foreseeable consequence of that institutional choice. The lawsuit was filed in federal court 8 weeks after the incident, naming Larson individually, the backup agent who had hesitated and not intervened, and the department as an institution. The central allegations covered violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, civil rights violations with documentable racial motivation, and institutional supervisory negligence established by the complaint history that had been systematically ignored. The amount sought was not disclosed at the time of filing by strategic choice of James's attorneys, who had learned in prior cases that announcing specific amounts before the process develops frequently frames the public narrative in a way that benefits the opposing party more than the client. What was disclosed were the non-financial conditions that James had determined were non-negotiable from the first day, Larson's: dismissal without possibility of rehire in any law enforcement capacity, complete revision of protocols for interacting with people with disabilities throughout the department, and verifiable mandatory training that could not be completed on paper alone. Larson was dismissed 4 months after the incident, after the internal investigation concluded that he had violated multiple departmental protocols and that the complaint history made it impossible to treat the incident as an isolated deviation. The police union filed an appeal that was denied on second review after the external reviewer confirmed the internal investigation's findings and added his own analysis that the white cane had been visible from the first second of the body camera and that no standard training in any department in the country could be interpreted as authorizing the approach that had been made. That specific language from the external reviewer, that no standard training authorized what had been done, closed the path to any operational discretion argument the union might have attempted to construct in a higher instance. James received the item he had ordered at the musical instrument store 3 days after being released on that sidewalk, during a visit the store had arranged outside normal business hours after the employee who had answered the call that morning learned what had happened. That visit was not on any recording and was not part of any legal record. It was simply a man walking into a store with his cane and leaving with what he had gone to find. The agreement that closed the federal lawsuit was signed 6 months after the incident. The financial amount remained confidential. The institutional conditions were made public at James's insistence, who had argued that the only outcome that justified the time and energy invested was an outcome that existed as a verifiable record beyond that specific case. Larson had lost his career, the department had changed its protocols, and James had returned to that commercial street some weeks after the agreement was signed, had covered the same route he had planned on that November morning, had entered the musical instrument store for the second time and had left with his cane in hand navigating the sidewalk with the same low rhythmic arc that anyone who saw him would immediately recognize for what it was. The same movement that had been visible on the body camera from the very first second. The movement that should never have been enough for anything other than letting him pass.
Equity is an ongoing path, and information is your greatest armor. We appreciate your viewership and dedication to undeniable truth.